Good morning, everyone. Thank you. I'd like to thank the Pontifical Academy of Sciences for convening this excellent symposium, and I'd particularly like to thank Dr. Raven for personally inviting me to speak to you today. What I'd like to talk to you about, and my core focus of my talk, will be on the Center for Plant Conservation, our network in the United States that we use to coordinate conservation programs in botanic gardens, zoos, and other similar organizations, and the efficacy of that network in terms of addressing conservation challenges there. I'll also touch on some of the more broad implications of what we do, and then identify some areas for necessary growth that will be required for us to truly address the conservation challenges that we face. Could I have the timer, please? So, in overview, I want to go back to a few of the concepts that Dr. Raven brought up, particularly concerning plant diversity. He mentioned the numbers of plants on this planet, over 400,000 kinds of identified plants, with potentially 50,000 or more species yet to be identified. It's a remarkable amount of diversity. Those plants have been evolving on this planet for arguably 1 million years, but on land on the order of about 460 million years ago. The advent of the success of plants on land fundamentally changed this planet to shape it into the ecosystem that we fundamentally depend on today. When you think about the value of plants in terms of ecosystem services, they clean the air, water, soil. They provide countless resources for us. The beautiful meals that we've been enjoying during this symposium are a core example of that. I find it interesting that at every break, a large contingent of us run to the outside to get a fresh breath of air. We can, of course, thank plants for that. The oxygen levels in the environment hover right around 20%. Too little air, as you know, the effects of that. Too much oxygen and wet organic matter likes to spontaneously combust. We're all wet organic matter, so we prefer not to. Oh, thank you. Prefer not to spontaneously combust. Plants in general are incredibly useful. Many of us would be inappropriately dressed if it wasn't for cotton today for this meeting, among other things. So again, plant diversity is essential to us. Without plants, there would be no us. That diversity is unfortunately not appreciated as much as one would think, given its incredible fundamental value to our lives. The numbers of species that face extinction is a primary example of how little we appreciate them. Current estimates suggest that around the world, 80,000 kinds of plants or more could go extinct in this century if current trends continue. That's an alarming number of plants. In my region of focus with the Center for Plant Conservation, of the 15,000 or so kinds of plants, we have over 4,000 of those of primary conservation concern. Again, those species that will inevitably go extinct if those trends continue. To address this, we focused on a number of things, but one of the primary areas that of human interest that has really benefited our understanding of plants as well as the conservation of those species are botanic gardens. Botanic gardens have been in existence for basically as long as modern civilization has come about. And our appreciation of plants in the botanic garden and the use of botanic gardens really addresses that fundamental connection we have with plants that I just described and that Peter so artfully described for you moments ago. Botanic gardens are basically saviors for plants in so many ways. When you think about the species that are housed in plants, our understanding of the knowledge of the diversity stems from the work that's done in botanic gardens. They're connected with universities around the world, and so our basic understanding of plant diversity stems from the work that's done in botanic gardens. Plants are connected to people in a fundamental way through these institutions, and they serve a vital role for continuing to educate the world about the value of plants. not just an education tool or a safe haven for us to escape the busy, chaotic modern world. They're also a center of primary research and conservation effort for plants. In the United States, we have a number of primary institutions that are focused on the conservation of species broadly. These organizations, including Dr. Raven's Missouri Botanical Garden in St. Louis, Missouri, Atlanta Botanic Garden in the U.S. Southeast. Out in California, where I'm based, we have Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, and also a number of zoos that focus on plants and plant conservation, including where the Center for Plant Conservation is based at San Diego Zoo Global. These organizations independently work to better understand plants and also work to save them. The Center for Plant Conservation was formed in 1984 to address challenges that existed, particularly in communication between these organizations. So flash back to 35 years ago, and the internet was in its infancy. Communication was much different than it is today. And those communication challenges manifested themselves in various ways, including the formation of silos, information silos in each of these institutions. There was increasingly a lot of work going on in terms of better understanding of the conservation challenges that we face and our ability to save species long term for whatever the future would hold. But sharing that information broadly was limited. So the Center for Plant Conservation, again, was formed to facilitate communication, to break down those silos, and to share best practices in ways that more and more conservation partners could engage in conservation in a way that was both informed and effective. Flash forward to today, and we know that communication has changed broadly. But the challenges that existed 35 years ago when CPC was formed still exist. We find those challenges occurring where efforts are repeated or duplicated, where we have communication of ideas slowed through our processes, including how we choose to share basic understanding of conservation challenges, and then how we're able to implement those changes in ways that are again both efficient and effective. So the Center for Plant Conservation has been addressing those challenges, and one of the primary ways we do that is a threefold process where we look at advancing the science of saving plants, applying that to the actual conservation of species in our primary region, and then advocating on behalf of plants and also the institutions and organizations and principles that serve the conservation community and allow us to expand on our ability to save plants. Using that model, we've been focusing on increasing a number of outputs for plant conservation. And we're looking at tying in this to our partnerships and our other various avenues of conservation focus. So through advancing, applying, and advocating, we've been able to identify some of those core challenges that are limiting our ability to save species. One of those is the science behind what it takes to manage species out of their environment. You'll hear later from Christina Walters some of the amazing challenges that exist in simply banking seeds. Historically and erroneously, we often think plants are relatively easy to store because of the seeds that they produce. There's been an amazing amount of effort over the last several decades going into banking seeds, but unfortunately these efforts have been for naught in some instances because of our lack of understanding about the unique requirements oftentimes in many of these species to store them long term in those conditions. So there's an incredible amount of knowledge that needs to be built around the conservation challenges for seed banking and similar efforts. We're also finding that managing plants long term in botanic gardens is not necessarily a done deal. Again, we often think that if we can collect a plant, we can manage that individually in a collection in a garden. Current estimates and statistics on the survival of plant species in collections is remarkably low. The chances of those living collections surviving the first year are quite dismal. And surviving as long as 7 years is incredibly rare. That tends to be the general life expectancy for a plant in a living collection in a garden. So it's not exactly the safekeeping that one would hope for these living collections. So understanding not only what it takes to increase the survivorship of those species, but also accounting for it when we bring these collections out of the wild into these safekeeping environments, to basically work within the constraints of those challenges just described, so that we can more effectively manage those species. Along the lines of managing those species, we're also looking at the conservation genetics and what it takes to actually manage the diversity of these collections. Much like zoos are doing today, and we actually learn quite a bit from the models that exist in zoo management of living collections, you have to consider the overall genetic diversity of a species when you're talking about true conservation collections of those species. And there's quite a bit of research in the Center for Plant Conservation Network focused on that very problem, what it actually takes to manage the genetic diversity. The Center for Plant Conservation has been working for several decades now to develop guidelines and best practices, including on how to manage that genetic diversity. And we have general recommendations for numbers of seeds, for example, that should be collected, how you collect those from those populations, and then how those are then distributed in collections for long-term management. The challenge oftentimes is the actual the cost of doing this work and the numbers of individuals that actually can engage in it. So some research that's going on now, for example, is designed to address that challenge. How little can we get away with? Which sounds like a way out, but what we're talking about is being able to distribute the limited resources that we have for conservation challenges in ways that we can effectively work towards saving species, as many species as possible. Those limited resources can go much further. For example, if you only need a dozen or so, 12 or so of a tree species in living collections instead of an exhaustive collection representing the vast amount of diversity in those species. And we're finding in some instances that is possible, again allowing us to distribute those resources beyond. So the Center for Plant Conservation Network, as I've described, really it's a collective meta management of these species. In our actual work, we manage what is called the National Collection of Endangered Plants, and this is the CPC meta collection, so it's managed in multiple institutions. We now have 58 participating institutions, a number of gardens, zoos, similar organizations around the US and Canada and US outlying territories that work to manage this collection. Of those 4,000 or so kinds of plants that I mentioned in the beginning of this talk that are threatened or endangered or face imminent extinction within our region of concern, we have now just over 1,500 of those in verified conservation collections, which is roughly a third or more of those species. These are maintained in the ways that I've described, including in seed banks, living collections, and also extensively monitored in the wild, and efforts to reintroduce those species or translocate those species are being conducted on any number of these species at any given time. The wonderful idea of the National Collection, and one of the strengths of this model, is that we have any one or more of our participating institutions that agree to take charge of those species. We have effectively experts that are concerned about the long-term survival of those species, and as all of us in this room recognize that unless we choose to care about these species, whether they're plants, animals, or other, their chances for survival into the next century are slim to none. So the Center for Plant Conservation model is that core focus of this distributed concern for these species of concern in a way that helps us to ensure that things continue to go right for those species. Now, that's not to say that the species in the care of these individuals or organizations are always, they're not always going in the right direction, and they're not always able to effectively address the conservation challenges that face those species. But another strength of the network is that shared responsibility. It's the fact that if we don't have the answers in one particular segment, we can go to others to find out that information and to share it broadly. That again is the CPC model and one of the reasons it has been effective, but these numbers, as excited as we are quite low. 1,500 of an estimated 80,000 kinds of plants around the world. That's just a drop in the bucket, as we say. And what can we do to really expand on that in a way that's effective within our region? So to have all 4,400 or so estimated species of concern in verified conservation collections, effectively securing all the plants of North America, North of Mexico, including U.S. outlying territories, secured from extinction. What's it going to take to move that forward? Well, if you look at the basic numbers, we effectively need to triple our efforts to be able to do that. The challenge, though, is the economic and human power that goes into saving these species. Prior to coming on board with the Center for Plant Conservation in 2014, I was Director of Plant Conservation and Science at National Tropical Botanic Garden. And I was part of a statewide strategy in the Hawaiian Islands for developing conservation initiatives concerning plants. And we did some back-of-the-envelope calculations on what it would cost to save the species of conservation concern in Hawaii. There's about 1,400 or so native species in the Hawaiian Islands, and over half of those are thought to be of critical conservation concern. There's over 200 kinds of plants in Hawaii that have fewer than 50 individuals remaining in the wild. It's an amazing, a daunting challenge, often recognized as the extinction capital of the world. But to save those 700 kinds of plants, it quickly went into the billions of dollars. When was the last time you heard billions of dollars going into plant conservation or even conservation in general? It's an overwhelming amount of resources doing it the way we do now. We need to do it smarter and we need to do it more efficiently. And that's one of the areas of primary interest I have as we continue to expand on the Center for Plant Conservation Network. How can we change what we do in a fundamental way that will allow us to address these challenges on a much more broad scale? Not just 1/3 of the plants in one particular region, but to truly address those 80,000 kinds of plants. My colleague and friend Paul Smith is going to be talking in general about the global challenges that Peter and I have alluded to. But in our network, we continue to focus in a way that ideally can be used as a model for others. So to exponentially increase our output, one of the things that we're focusing on is that communication. We're developing tools now through our online resources and the power of the cloud to better share information in real time. Not just data management, but also the success, the challenges, the failures in ways that our partners can quickly assimilate that information and apply it to other species being worked on. We're not looking at creating additional tools or additional areas for data entry, for example, that add more work to our already overworked network of partners. We're looking at ways of streamlining those efforts. Imagine if you're able to enter information in a way that shares your research on a particular plant, similar to how you would do through scientific publication, but in a way that others can immediately embrace that knowledge and use that to apply to other species. In that way, you could effectively, conceivably, save one species, and yet others could save two more, thereby tripling our efforts to save those species. Similarly, Paul and I were just talking yesterday about the ability of our experts to go in and apply that expertise in other areas, mobilizing those scientists, those conservationists in a way that allows them to use their time and knowledge to more effectively save species in other regions. Through our network, we're working to help mobilize those kinds of initiatives in ways that are effective to move things forward. We're also looking at data sharing practices. As we all know, data management tends to be one of the most challenging aspects of what we do. So to better effectively manage data in ways that, again, does not increase the workload of our partners, but helps to streamline that effort to reduce that workload, and yet allows us to better understand the overall effects of our work and the ultimate outcome of saving species. So I'd like to close on a note of optimism. The Center for Plant Conservation's model for effectively conserving plant species has really inspired now a couple of generations of conservationists to do more with what they have. We have an opportunity to inspire many others to save species through our concerted efforts, but also through highlighting our successes by focusing on the species that we have been able to save and recognizing how those efforts can be expanded to many more species, ideally to conserve those plants that are so vital to our existence. We are going to be successful at this. It will continue to take communication like we're doing now and sharing it broadly to as many people as possible, but I'm optimistic about the future because of the work that people in this room are doing, those partners that I work with on a daily basis, and all those who increasingly understand why what we do is so important. So with that, thank you for your time, and I'd love to take some questions.